Previously on Popping Collars.
You could take Olaf out. I love him, but you can take him out.
Yeah, I mean, as a matter of fact, you could make the argument in the storytelling that, I mean, just doesn't even belong at all.
Yeah, he's an odd character.
At least the Jar Jar Binks of that film. I mean, isn't he?
Oh my god. Olaf is Jar Jar Binks. That's hilarious.
I mean, Finn can be Chewbacca, but Olaf is Jar Jar Binks.
Welcome to Popping Collars, the podcast that lives at the intersection between religion and pop culture, the show where priests, pastors, ministers, and religious thinkers from around the country weigh in on what people are binge watching, tweeting about, trolling on message boards, and celebrating on blogs. My name is Greg Knight. I am in Palm Beach, Florida, and I'm your host of this roundtable conversation with our guests, who this week include the usual suspects. Betsy Gonzalez from Alexandria, Virginia. Hello, Betsy.
Hello, Greg.
And Liz Easton from Omaha, Nebraska. Hello, Liz.
Hey, Greg. Hey, Betsy.
We got the band back together.
Yeah.
Would you? Oh no, I feel bad. Hey, Liz, I didn't say hi to you.
Okay.
Sorry.
This is episode 16 of Popping Collars, and our topic today is cereal. So let that sink in for a second. And now that your mind is sufficiently blown because you're listening to a podcast about a podcast, let's get into it. Serial is a podcast that in its first season at least looked into the murder of a young woman named Hae Min Lee in Baltimore, Maryland, a case that was ultimately solved with the arrest and conviction of Hae's boyfriend, Adnan Syed. Over the course of the show, Adnan's guilt comes into question as layer after layer of the case built against him is stripped away, revealing a complex network of fractured relationships, sometimes contradictory testimony, and a Best Buy payphone that may or may not have existed. It's a compelling story of guilt and innocence that is produced in a way that draws you deeper and deeper into the narrative. So, question to get us going. At what point were you drawn into the story? And what was the character or the situation that kind of sucked you in?
Well, I can start, I think.
Okay.
So I spend a lot of my time in cars. One car in particular. I drive a lot. Our Diocese of Nebraska is the whole state of Nebraska, so I'm driving a lot. There's a lot of miles to burn. So a good podcast can make the miles go by a little faster. So I think I listened to the first couple of episodes on a road trip. And what I liked about it was that it was entertaining, it almost in the way that a TV show was, and it was visual, in my imagination, while still allowing me to keep my eyes on the road. But then I was so compelled that I didn't wait for my next road trip. I just kept listening to it at home after that and then kept on top of it. But mainly the thing that was attractive to me or that sucked me in was kind of peer pressure and all of my friends being like, have you listened to Serial? Have you listened to Serial? Oh, my gosh. And it became like a topic of conversation at parties. It became, friends texting about it after new episodes came out. So it was half the medium itself of a really compelling podcast that was serialized and half just friends sort of making me do it.
So you were in on day one.
Pretty much. I'm really, really hip, Greg. It's sort of like the old radio shows, before television. That were, tune in next week for whatever. There's a precedence for that, but we've forgotten it. Mm-hmm. That radio can be that way.
Right. Well, I was in it from the beginning, just being a This American Life listener. And so knowing the merry band of characters of, reporters who put that together and being a huge fan of Vocal Fry on any audio, on anything, which I didn't even know was a thing until the other day, that I must love Vocal Fry because I enjoy the rhythm of those podcasts, the personality of the radio program, the all of that. I'm a sucker for it. So anyway, they played the first episode on This American Life. This was all we're going to do today. And I'm like, okay. And then, just the idea of being in on a new project. So it was like, why not? Why not get into this? And then it becomes the water cooler thing. And that just pushes me on even further. Like, oh, everybody's talking about it. Oh, something I get to talk about with more people. Excellent. I love talking with more people. So you enjoy kind of going along for the ride. And just, it was unsettling. It's disturbing.
Yeah. So that's what totally kind of hooked me in. Because you guys were early because you're hip and cool. I was late because I'm not hip nor cool. So I listened to it about a month ago, just kind of like binge listening, if that's a thing, to, episode after episode over the course of maybe 2 days at work. And there were two things that I could kind of point to, I think, that totally hooked me. One was the music. It was the ding ding kind of piano music that had this haunting feel to it, and also this kind of like, I don't know what's coming next kind of feel to it. And then the other one was the Linkin Park episode.
Yeah.
Where it was following who the anonymous guy that discovers Heyman's body, and just there was something just really creepy about that whole episode. And I remembered listening to it and thinking, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Like, what's going to happen next? It was
well, that was the episode.
Total suspense, total thriller. Yeah.
The Linkin Park episode, or Lincoln, if you want to talk like the locals,
right.
was the episode where you started thinking, like, wait a minute, I might be able to solve this. Because you're finally introduced to people who could be suspects and you don't know if they are. And that's probably like when Reddit started going crazy and everything. It started to feel like, I might be able to figure this out, or we might be able to figure this out.
Well, that's always the draw of any procedural show that you get your hands on, whether it's, CSI or Law and Order or whatever, like kind of someone gives it away, that there's a nugget out there that you're going to find. There's the gun, the letter, the whatever it is. And then you're going to be like, aha, and that's going to happen. I think the realism of how it ends with, okay, this appeals, we're working on this appeal, about how his case was handled, and there's no, Adnan, if you were thinking he's not guilty, walking out of jail into the arms of his family. You're not getting, the payoff that I think that you desperately are used to in this day and age in terms of shows like this.
Right, which is so real. I mean, I don't know, have either of you guys served on a jury before?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know if you had this experience, but I served on a jury right before going to seminary, and it was a long trial. It was almost a month when it was all said and done. And we ended up being a hung jury because one juror who was very young was really caught out. She was a criminal justice major in college and probably like a freshman. And she was really caught up in finding some way, in retrospect, I see this, to make what was really before us conform to what we see on TV and in movies, and how that narrative is crafted. And, of course, that's impossible. And it's one of the really scary things about our justice system is how little we really know at the end of the day. And even when things come to trial. But it was so frustrating because she was like examining evidence herself.
The thing about detective shows and things like that is that we like to think that we're kind of observant. We like to think that we're, sort of paying attention. But in reality, we're not paying attention a lot. Unless something really significant happens, we're really not storing that information away. And so you can totally see how you run into a situation where you just can't quite trust what it is that you're hearing from people who were witnesses, giving testimony.
Mm-hmm. It's like when you run the narrative of your story through a single event, And it almost makes the players in that event seem so careless that they just can't remember that or this, you know, but we're so caught up in the narration of our own lives. And, you know, the inner monologue that we all carry around like we're in the confessional room on The Real World or something. And then I did this, you know, this is the music that's backing this walk that I'm taking down the street here, the coffee house to meet this person. I mean, that we get in this habit of making like, you know, like MacBooks, you know, like, you know, on iPhoto that you can make, you know, like kind of putting the pictures together, writing the story. And this is what this year was, or this is what this wedding was, or this is what, you know, my baby's first year is, whatever. You know, we like to create narrative. We get sucked into it. And we love it. But that when you run life through one event, one day, the ability that we have to really remember hard and fast what happened, we'd like to think we could also do that in the same way we're all Sherlock Holmes.
You just remember what's meaningful to you, really, or what you think is meaningful to you. But it's funny that you mentioned Sherlock Holmes, Betsy, because I think that is probably where a lot of this goes to, is the observational detective. That he would solve crimes just by his being able to observe things in a different way. And that's definitely what Reddit was trying to do with Serial and with the Boston Bomber, and with, you know, we all like to think that we can notice something that other people can't notice, when in fact we all have these little lenses that are really, really biased.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly that's, having just watched The Jinx, like the difference between those two stories is that Robert Durst has money, so he can mount a defense.
Right.
And Adnan doesn't.
Right. Well, I think it's that, right, the powerlessness that comes inside, less privilege, decreased privilege.
Right. It's this story about people without privilege and people of color, and not the stereotypical NPR listener is privileged and right. I mean, at least in my mind, if everyone is like Ira Glass and Sarah Koenig. And it became this huge phenomenon. And what's really interesting to me is everyone is listening to it. And like all of my friends were like, oh, are you going to donate to Serial? Are you going to give money for the second season? Are you going to give money to this or that? And I'm like, you guys don't do any charitable giving. Really, I mean, most of my friends who aren't involved in churches, like that's not a big part of their financial landscape, and they're like so quick to give to Serial. So what is it that they tapped into? It was a podcast.
I think that there are two ways to listen to the show. I think that there's this way of sort of approaching the show that you're like, well, I'm kind of open to wherever the story goes, you know, maybe this guy's guilty, maybe he's innocent, but you know, let me hear the story. What's your story, right? And then there's this other piece that, because some of the early episodes draw into question, you know, some key pieces of evidence, all of a sudden your brain starts thinking, wait, he didn't do it. Let's figure out who did, right? So now it's not a he done it, or it's a who done it in a very real way. And it's almost like people eliminate Adnan as a suspect immediately because that's too obvious, right? Like, you know, this story has to be like more entertaining, more compelling. It's got to be someone that you wouldn't think of, you know, that kind of thing. So who are the potential suspects? And all of a sudden, yeah, you're inventing a story in your brain that may not exist. I think that you know, this idea of searching for, you know, maybe if I listen really carefully, I'm going to be the person that hears that key piece of evidence.
Well, and I think one of my favorite episodes, I think it was towards the latter part of the series, was when he really puts it to Sarah Koenig and says, you know, you don't really know me.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't really know me. You're getting to know me through this one event. And you know, she can talk about his life in prison and, you know, those sorts of things, but you don't really know me in terms of being someone who loves personal storytelling and all of that, and who does it professionally. It was really like one of those, oh, I was sitting here thinking, I know him. He's
Right.
calling me out listening to this because I don't know him. If she doesn't know him, I definitely don't know him.
One of the problematic pieces of the procedural, the Law and Orders, the CSIs of the world, is that everything's wrapped up in an hour. And you get the sense that, like, that's kind of how criminal justice should work. Betsy makes a great point that people kind of see themselves as the heroes of their own movie when they look back on their life. And I think that's true. I think pop culture really influences a lot of the ways that we kind of see our life. Like, we do frame our lives in terms of a movie. And sometimes we see crimes and things like that, and we think, oh, that shouldn't take long. It should be solved pretty quickly because they can do it in an hour on TV, And it's like this total disconnect between reality and really what happened, like reality and this narrative that you kind of make up for yourself. And I think that's kind of what can happen, is that in this kind of pursuit of justice, you just look for, well, what's the quickest justice we can get? Because we need to wrap this up, right? This case is taking way too long.
Well, but then on the other hand, how nice and tidy that little HBO Jinx activity just kind of wraps up with an arrest, and how a little easy, well done, but just interesting. I mean, it's the payoff that you were hoping for, or some action, more action on the serial front.
That was how I felt watching the Jinx. Was this is what I wanted Serial to be, without examining too much the values under that desire or the ethical considerations of the storytellers in it. But what I wanted Sarah Koenig to do was to show up on the new podcast saying, like, and we found a diary entry from 1999, and this seals the deal, or there's been handwriting analysis or whatever. And that did happen in the Jinx, which once you actually get through the show, I don't know about you, Greg, but I almost felt a little dirty afterwards for how good it felt, like how satisfied I felt that they produced this new evidence and wrapped it up nicely, because it is so not real life.
So I think the satisfying thing about the Jinx is the ending, as opposed to Serial's ending. Serial has a very open-ended, more true-to-life ending that we really don't know. We're really, we've got this system, and we'll let the system kind of handle appeals, and we'll see where it goes, but we really don't know. Whereas the Jinx ends, and you do know. You know 100% like what's happening. So last Saturday Night Live ran a bit during Weekend Update, and it was talking about sort of how the Jinx as a cultural phenomenon has kind of glorified serial killers. And they ran the opening to the show, and then they put, like, this is how we do it over the top of it. And I didn't actually see it on the show. I saw it this morning on a morning news show. And so they show the clip, and they cut to the reporters, and the reporters are like, well, I don't think the families of the victims are going to like that. I sort of caught myself in this moment of like, oh yeah, this is kind of real. This is a real thing. These are real people that died. And that's the thing about, like, even Serial. It's like, at some point, oh yeah, that's right, they're not characters.
Right.
Heyman was an actual person.
Well, and her brother, allegedly, it may not have really been him, sort of came out on a Reddit thread and said that very thing. Like, for you, my sister is a character in this mystery, but you didn't lose her, and you didn't see my mother crying every day. And that is a reminder that we all kind of need, that other people's suffering should not be entertainment for us. It can be educating, I think, appropriately. So I thought about that with Serial, and then I felt dirty about it with the Jinx.
I'm totally blown away by these two stories, between Adnan's story and Robert Durst's story, because the difference between them is class, privilege, money. Like, Adnan can't afford to mount a defense, and Robert Durst can.
Right.
And therefore Adnan pleads guilty when he may be innocent.
Mm-hmm.
And Robert Durst pleads not guilty.
Right, which
when
is not that unusual.
Right, yeah.
For innocent people to plead guilty just because they think it's a foregone conclusion. And
like this idea that, you know, you can be pressured into saying something that may not be true just to kind of be done with it. I think that's really powerful that people can have that kind of control over you. I don't think the Jinx exists without Serial. I think Serial has to become a mega hit for the Jinx to even get picked up.
Yeah.
In fact, and that's where you get back into this awkward piece of entertainment and true life. This is a crime, and these are victims of a crime that this man has committed, and yet we, as consumers of media and as consumers of pop culture, it's a mirror, right, to who the audience is that's watching this, and saying, are you watching this as entertainment? Are you watching this as educated? Like, what is it? What are we requiring of our nonfiction that we're trying to pigeonhole it into the same world as our fiction?
Right.
Right.
Did either of you guys watch Black Mirror, the BBC?
Oh, no, I've heard it's really good.
It's really good. It's kind of like the Twilight Zone, but it's about the way that technology affects our culture. And there's at least one episode, and I didn't think about talking about this, so I probably can't be that articulate, but it's about justice kind of as a reality show. And I think there are 2 episodes about reality shows just kind of gone amok in the future. And that's really what the Jinx made me think of, that real justice was manipulated for our entertainment. And that is kind of like a Brave New World, right? Like that maybe is a point where we collectively have to say, we've gone too far. 10 years ago, 50 years ago, this would have been outrageous.
All of these stories, like even Serial, you know, at some point it was a local news story, right? And you can go and watch the old Baltimore Channel 2 news clip of like the discovery of Heyman's body, right? And so like all of this stuff exists. You can hear the talking head, like the anchors of local news now, sort of running in a clip through these documentaries of like, you know, body was discovered in Galveston, Texas, blah, blah, blah. And it's like the way that we consume that news and the way that we consume news when it's got like dinging little piano tunes and, you know, reenactments that are staged in a way that make us perceive reality in a very specific way. Like all of a sudden, you know, this Robert Durst story that was meaningless to me when it existed on that local news level. Mm-hmm. Now all of a sudden it's this documentary. It's you know, now it's more compelling.
Well, and then it also makes me think about, you know, the parts of my vows in my life as a priest. The hearing of confession. When you're in a conversation with somebody and they want to say something that they don't want repeated. You know, I come from a journalism background, so I understand off the record. I get that. And now as a priest, it's, well, this is under the stole, right? So, you know, that we're not going to talk about this outside of you and me. And so it's this, you know, there is something about being let behind the curtain on people's lives and knowing what a place of privilege that is to be allowed. And I think that there's some of that Sarah Koenig was feeling her own self pulled to, you know, feeling like you've been allowed into this sacred place of people really talking to you. But then having it be heard by millions of people. Whereas, you know, for that happens to me in my office or in a corner of my life, you know, that people are carrying around these, you know, it's not always murder, but, you know, they're carrying around these terrible things that are eating them up.
It's not always murder, Betsy? It's
not always murder. Liz, it's under the stole. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to go into specifics with you. Okay? Okay. But they're carrying around.
Wait, are you on season 2 of Serial?
Stop it. I'm not talking about this. I've signed non-disclosure agreements. I'm sorry. No, but that they're carrying around terrible things inside them that are eating them up. Mm-hmm. And that there's something about talking about it that is this unburdening. And you think you have some control over how you share it. And if you get to tell the story, and I think about Durst with this, if you get to tell the story, then you get to somehow control it. You know, but that there's those times when the story has us. We don't have the story.
Yeah. Yeah, I think all of this sort of makes me think of Truman Capote, too, who we can probably blame or credit for all of this. And he really did the same thing in a pretty masterfully manipulative way also within Cold Blood by, like, deeply befriending these killers. And the popularity, that was in Cold Blood was a serialized story in the New Yorker. So as long as he kept the serial going, these guys' lives kept going because they kept getting appeals and appeals and appeals. And finally, he needed the story to end. So he ended the book so that they could hang. And a lot of people credit that for killing him, basically, that it was after that he ended up really drinking himself to death, that there's a great privilege of being behind the curtain or under the stole, but it's also a tremendous amount of power.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I like about this conversation is that Serial and the Jinx are messier stories than they're sort of presented to us. Because, you know, I think I heard someone at church say the other day, like, oh, I like it when we say crucify him in the Passion narrative, because if we were there, that's probably what we would do. We would be in the crowd saying crucify him. And I was like, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think the majority of us wouldn't be saying anything. We would just go on with our lives, because who has time to stop and look at what's happening, right? Like, I mean, you know, we may say crucify him, we may say something else, and we may just walk on by. And I think most of us are walk on by kind of people.
But what we know as humans is what's going on is fear and sin and poverty and oppression and privilege and not having it. And that's the stuff I sort of chose not to wrestle with, that in the moment of listening to Serial, when that's all really, really real, is we're listening to stories of disaffected and, you know, kids without privilege and without advocates.
Gosh, that's a hard thing for us to admit, especially with Serial, with like this #1 podcast, all this stuff. We like to think like, oh no, Adnan's totally worth it. He's worth it. But before this podcast, who was in Adnan's corner?
No, you want that stereotypical NPR audience that we imagine from SNL skits and you know, whatever demos, you know, to touch that place of dead ends and lack of opportunity, and knowing that if I was accused of something, the amount of force that would have my back, you know, I would think that if I didn't do it, that I would have that support, and that there are parts of just intrinsically how I'm made, and, you know, and having an attorney in my family, and, you know, all those things would lead it so that could never happen to me. Well,
and I mean, our prisons are full of guys like that. Mm-hmm. They're full of, I mean, it's really kind of an atrocity. And Adnan says that he knows guys who, at the end of the day, just stopped appealing because they were like, it is not worth it. I have a life in prison. I may as well keep living it. I'm never going to get out of here. And what a sad and terrifying thing that by an accident of birth, all of us and Robert Durst don't have to make those decisions.
our Going Pieces segment. This is where we let people know how they can get in touch with us and promote how we can get in touch with people. So, Liz, where are you? What are you doing? And how can people get in touch with you?
I am the canon to the ordinary for the Diocese of Nebraska. And you can follow me on Twitter at Liz East, or this always makes Greg laugh, on Instagram at diocese_of_Nebraska, which is the worst name ever. But that way you can see pretty pictures of Nebraska.
And Wandering Clarkson.
Oh, and our little friend, #Wandering Clarkson. He blogs at wanderingclarkson.com.
Betsy, where are you? What are you doing? How can people get in touch with you?
I am at the historic Episcopal High School here in Alexandria, Virginia. And I serve here as one of the assistant chaplains. And you can find me on Twitter at Betsy_Goms, and as well as through the Episcopal website, if you so choose. I'm currently on the website, the face of looking inward. We have our, campaign, kind of how we think about ourselves as looking outward and being in DC. But I'm on the looking inward photo slide on the thing. So, so you can check me out there.
My name is Greg Knight. I'm the Director of Children and Youth Ministries at Bethesda by the Sea Episcopal Church in Palm Beach, Florida, where you can find us on the web at bbts.org. Popping Collars is all over the place. We are on Twitter at Popping Collars. We are on the Facebook, where you can like us or friend us. We like friends. We like likes. They are both acceptable forms of communication. You can also find us on Instagram now. We're at Popping Collars Podcast, where you can follow us and see silly photos. You can email us, poppingcollarspodcast@gmail.com. Where you can find our show is at the usual suspects, wherever you find your podcasts: Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, iTunes. You can also find us on our website, poppingcollarspodcast.com. We are also featured on Episcopal Cafe with all of our shows, and we love their website. And please go check them out at episcopalcafe.com, where you can see some awesome articles while you listen to us talk about other people's podcasts. That is Popping Collars for this week. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Betsy, for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Keep those collars popped!
Woo!